Welcome, and thank you for joining our Leadership in Extraordinary Times event. I hope you're all thriving despite the unusual year that we've had. We're streaming live on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn, and I understand that there are participants joining us from all over the world. My name is Aruma Ote. I'm executive in residence at Said Business School, University of Oxford. I'm delighted to be hosting today's edition of our Leadership in Extraordinary Times series. The theme, as you know, is COVID-19 economics, myths, markets, and policy. This is such an important topic as COVID-19 is unfortunately still very much with the world. As at yesterday, over 50.4 million people had been infected and 1.25 million people had unfortunately passed away. There are surges in Europe, in Lebanon, in the US, and a few other countries. On a positive note, we hear of progress being made in therapeutics and vaccines around the world. One of the reasons I joined Said Business School in January 2019 was my attraction to its laudable mission, which is to focus on solving world-scale challenges. This focus has been made even more apparent this year through the many research topics and the initiatives that Said Business School has put in place in response to COVID-19. I was delighted to have personally been involved in the COVID-19 Rapid Response Accelerator Program hosted by the Oxford Foundry. You may also be aware of our LIBA project and the Creative Destruction Lab Recovery Program, which I hope one of our professors will talk about today. Today, you will be hearing from three of our distinguished professors who've been doing seminal work on COVID-19. The questions their research topics answer, in my view, will help society address the three challenges that COVID has presented us, which I like represented as attack on lives, attack on livelihoods, and an attack on liberties. We have only 1 hour for our event. So to allow time for questions and answers, I've asked each professor to take 10 minutes to present their key findings and conclusions. These presentations will be made in a series. Following their presentations, we will take your questions and comments. Please use the chat function throughout the event on whatever channel you're using to post your questions and comments. We'll do our best to respond, but remember we have a limited time together. You already have our bios, you have the research papers. So in the interest of time, let me hand over to Professor Renee Adams. She will present a paper on gender equality in work and COVID-19 deaths. Renee, over to you.
All right, thanks very much, Aruma. I hope you can all see my slides. So I'm here to talk about a myth. Well, I call it a myth. We can discuss this later. But the myth that I'm going to be addressing is the myth that somehow women have survived the COVID-19 pandemic much better than men have in terms of health outcomes. And let me first explain where this myth comes from. So I'm presenting here on the slide data from April 1st, 2020. I have cross-country data. What I'm plotting here is the percent of COVID-19 deaths that are attributed to women against the percent of COVID-19 cases that are attributed to women. This line right here, this red line, even though it may not seem so, is actually the 45-degree line. And what you can see is all the countries that I plotted here, they are significantly below the 45-degree line. So what does that mean? It means women may get sick, but they don't die at the same rate at which they get sick, right? So the percent of cases is significantly higher than the percent of COVID-19 deaths. So the translation of cases into deaths is at a lower than 1-to-1 rate. Okay, so basically what this means is there's gender inequality. So more men died of COVID-19 than women. At least that's what this picture suggests. Okay, so this picture raises many questions. So first, the obvious one is, well, what's the cause, right? How can there be this gender imbalance? And so there's been many articles written on this. And usually what people argue is the cause is that women somehow have some genetic superiority to men. Okay. Another hypothesis that has been advanced is that women engage in less risky behavior. They're less likely to engage in substance abuse, for example, which is a risk factor for COVID-19. Okay, so the questions are, what are the causes? And then what should we do about it? Should we do anything? And so some hypotheses or some proposals have been made. For example, people have argued that one should prioritize care for men. One has also argued that women should go back to work before men do. And people have even started injecting men with estrogen to give them the supposed magic powers of women. Okay, now, unfortunately, life is not so simple, right? So this is data from April 1st. Now I will show you data from November 2nd. So just a week ago. Again, I have exactly the same type of data. So the percent of COVID-19 deaths attributed to women plotted against the percent of COVID-19 cases attributed to women. Again, this red line is the 45-degree line. Now what you see is countries are clustered much more densely around the 45-degree line. So in April, countries were significantly below the 45-degree line. Now they're around the 45-degree line. What does that mean? It means that cases are translating into deaths for women. So the conversion rate has increased. Women, when they get sick, also die. Okay, so now you look at this picture, and it's no longer the case that you see a clear gender imbalance in COVID-19 health outcomes. Okay, so that's one observation. A second observation is there's significant variation across countries in the COVID-19 experiences that women have. So if genetics were the explanation for any observed gender imbalances in COVID-19 outcomes, then one would not expect the ratio of COVID-19 deaths attributed to women to vary significantly across countries, because genetics, one would argue, does not vary significantly across countries. Okay, so that's an observation that I think is very important and that I'm going to address in my research. So my hypothesis is not that women have potentially been experiencing better COVID-19 health outcomes because of some sort of genetic factors. But my hypothesis is that there's a social factor that explains the different outcomes. And in particular, my hypothesis is that work patterns can explain a lot of what we're observing. Now, why work patterns? Because work is associated with exposure. It's pretty simple, very straightforward hypothesis, and that's what I test. So what I did is I gathered data on women's participation in the full-time workforce across countries. So why full-time workforce? Because if you work full-time, you're more likely to be exposed to COVID-19. And here what I plot is the percent of COVID-19 deaths that are female against the percent of full-time workers in a country that are female. What you see is this red line here shows basically the linear relationship between these two variables. You see it's positively sloped. Basically, what this suggests is that when women participate more in the full-time workforce, they also participate more in COVID-19 deaths. If you like statistical analyses, I can show you that this result is statistically significant. It's not only graphical or visually there. So here I regress the percent of female deaths due to COVID-19 on the percent of full-time workers that are female. In these panels, I look at OECD countries. In these panels over here, I look at a broader sample. What you see is that this coefficient is positive and statistically significant. I also substitute a different measure of women's participation in the workforce, which is the World Economic Forum's Participation and Opportunity Score for the percent of full-time workers. That's what you observe in these two columns here and here. The Participation and Opportunity Score measures the participation gap, the remuneration gap, and the advancement gap. Okay, so the higher the score is, the lower all of these gaps are. And what you observe is that the coefficients on the Participation and Opportunity Score are also positive and significant. Again, what this suggests is that the lower the participation gap, the more women participate in the workforce, the more they also participate in COVID-19 deaths. So I don't have much time, so I'll probably skip some evidence on the mechanism that I provide in my research, but basically the story is pretty simple. So my argument is that the more women work, the more exposed they are to COVID-19. And some evidence I have that's consistent with this is I show that in countries where women work more, they also comprise a greater fraction of the medical profession. And as we know, when you participate in the medical profession, you're basically automatically exposed to COVID-19. Okay, so work is associated with greater exposure. I also show in my research that the more you work, the more underlying conditions you may have or you may develop that are risk factors for COVID-19. For example, if women work more, they seem to have a greater incidence of heart disease, which has been shown is linked to COVID-19 outcomes. So I'll skip that evidence for the sake of time, but basically, the story is pretty simple. What I show in my research is that work patterns help explain cross-country gender differences in COVID-19 outcomes. Work is a social factor, not a biological factor, and the policy implications are pretty clear. Basically, what I argue is that while biology may be important, one has to be extremely careful about conditioning policies and treatment on demographic characteristics. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Renee Adams. I'm actually very curious about whether there is an impact when by age. You've talked about the impact by gender. So maybe it's a chance for me to introduce Professor Pedro Bodalo, whose paper is entitled Older People Are Less Pessimistic About the Health Risk of COVID-19. So maybe you can share with us the age dimension. Thank you. Over to you, Pedro.
Thank you very much, Irma. So indeed, the myth I am going to discuss is what people believe about the age gradient of risks entailed by COVID-19. So just to start, a simple point that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, is really an unprecedented, widespread and life-threatening event that affects the whole world, and the evolution of the pandemic and potential economic recovery from it depends on how people will behave, both at the individual level and also collectively. And so it's really kind of a fascinating environment to ask the question, how do people form beliefs about a shock which is totally unprecedented? They have very little information beforehand. How do they form beliefs and how do they behave in face of such a shock? So the study that I will present asks the question, how do people perceive the health risks and the economic risks they face? And this is an important question because it's the balance between the health risks and the economic risks which will help us make decisions about what kind of policy response or health response we want to implement. Things like thinking about the value of lockdowns and other measures. So what do we do? we implement a survey asking people what they think and what they believe about the risks involved, focusing on three main questions. First, we ask about people's beliefs about the risks of being infected, being seriously sick or being hospitalized, and the risk of death from COVID-19. The idea here is to get a sense of whether people have a broad idea, an accurate idea of these risks and how they vary across different subpopulations. Second, we ask, how do these beliefs depend on the respondent's age? And we focus on age because age, as Rima was saying, is an important determinant of the risk of severe COVID-19. So it's a very relevant question for explaining individual choices, but also for explaining policy choices. And we also try to understand how beliefs depend on a variety of other factors, such as what information people have, where they get the information from, what kind of exposure they have to people being sick, and so forth. And third, all this information about what people think about is only useful if it's in some sense truthful. So if we can understand that the mapping between what people believe and what they actually do, how they behave afterwards. So we try to understand whether the beliefs are related to behavior. So what do we find? The first thing we find, thankfully, is that people have some idea about the actual risks of COVID. So what this graph shows you is what do people say is the risk of death conditional on being infected with COVID, depending on the age of the person, the sick person. So there are three blocks of bars that consider different age groups. So the left block of bars looks at the risk of death for people who are under 40. So this is what people think that the risk of death is for people who are under 40. The middle bar is the risk of death for people who are between 40 and 70. And the right-hand block is the risk of death for people who are above 70. Now, what you see is that the risk goes up with the patient's age, right? It goes up quite dramatically. This reflects the fact that we all know about, we hear about it every day, that older people are more susceptible to severe cases of COVID-19. That's great. Now, within each of these blocks, you see several sub-bars. These different sub-bars represent the beliefs of different types of people. In our case, different ages, people with different ages. So the blue bars are young people up to 34. The gray bars are 35 to 50, 50 to 70, and the yellow bars are people who are above 70, what they think. So what you see is that there is some disagreement across these age groups. People who, in the blue bars and in the gray bars, the younger people, perceive much greater risk of death from COVID for any given age group than older people. So there is some disagreement in the direction that younger people perceive higher risks throughout. Interesting to see where this comes from. But this is not, this disagreement is not all that you find. You find actually some radical departure from kind of accuracy in these beliefs. Here in the second graph, we look at a different measure. We ask people, what is the risk from COVID-19 for infection, hospitalization, and death for people like you? Okay? And so you can again see that the blue bars representing younger people are much higher than all the other bars, which shows that the younger people perceive higher risks of infection, of hospitalization, and of death for people like themselves than the older people. Okay, and it's really continuous. So of course you might say that younger people, so here in the left group of bars, younger people might think they are more likely to get infected than older people, partially because they have a more gregarious lifestyle. Okay, that's fine. So that might not be a big surprise. But if you go to measures of severe disease like hospitalization or death, conditional on being infected, young people are still much more pessimistic. They're much more worried about those outcomes for people of their age than older people. And in fact, they estimate twice the probability of death if they are sick than an older person above 70 estimates the risk of death if they get sick. So this is kind of an age gradient of beliefs that is dramatically counter the true age gradient of risk, showing that younger people are kind of across the board more pessimistic or more worried about COVID health risks than older people. And I will try to shed some light on why this is the case. Before I do that, let me just say a couple of other things that we find, which I think were interesting. First of all, the fact that we're talking about COVID all the time tends to make people worry about health in general. We see this in the survey, that when we ask about COVID, then asking about any other health risks, people become much more pessimistic about other health risks. They start thinking about, we ask about heart attack, cancer, and so on. People get very pessimistic about that. What is interesting is that there is no clear relationship between how worried people are about COVID for themselves or for other people, and how worried they are about economic risks. So you might think that there is some kind of a trade-off. People who are more worried about health risks are less worried about economic risks, but that's actually not the case. Everybody's kind of equally worried about economic risks. And the kind of a very important point that we see is that there's a very clear mapping between how worried you say you are about health risks, so what's the risk of death or what's the risk of hospitalization that you say, and what you think about policy choices about lockdowns and other things. So people who are more worried favor longer lockdowns, harsher lockdowns, and they also are more hesitant to seek medical care if they need it. They are much more hesitant to go out, to kind of go to a restaurant and things like that. So you see that the beliefs we measure seem to map into behavior, at least according to the survey. Now, why is it that young people are more pessimistic or more worried? Now, several different hypotheses come up. Here, I'm going to discuss 4 of them. One hypothesis is just the mere composition hypothesis. This is a survey that was run in the US over the last few months, and there's obviously a very clearly differences in narratives between kind of more conservative news outlets like Fox News and more kind of liberal news outlets like New York Times, where the conservative news outlets are much less worried and focused on COVID. So one natural possibility is that it's about politics. Older people are more Republican, and so they're less worried. That's actually not what we see. Even if you think about only Republican people or only Democratic people, you still see the age effect between young and old within each group. So it's not only about politics. It could be that the young people are kind of just less able to deal with adversity. They have had less experience and they see a shock and they kind of are less able to deal with it. It's actually interesting because we measure adversity in people's lives. We ask them about what has happened in their lives, loss of loved ones and other adversity measures. We do see that actually plays a role. People who have served in the military or people who have had more losses are actually less concerned. But the aging effect still endures. So we haven't explained it yet. It could be the news that you get. This is related but distinct from the political orientation. So as I said before, it is true that within people who watch Fox News and within people who watch CNN, you still see the age effect, that young people are more worried than the older people, even about themselves. So that doesn't quite explain it. An interesting thing that comes up, however, is the level of exposure to social media, in particular to Twitter. The more you see Twitter, the more you are concerned about COVID. And this effect is actually larger for young people, conditional on how much they see Twitter. So this seems to be helping us go and understand where these effects come from. And this leads us to kind of the last hypothesis that we look at, that I'll talk about today, which is, are the young people more impressionable in general? This is kind of a broader notion. It's like, are they more impressionable about the news that they see about COVID, but they could also be more impressionable about news that they see about politics or about conflict or about progress or technology or anything else. And so this is actually a hypothesis that is out there. People in sociology and psychology have thought about this. The idea being that if you are an older person, you have seen a lot of things, you have experienced a lot of things, you are much more moderate in how you react to news and to events, and young people are just kind of very excited and they react a lot to what they see. So how does this relate to our evidence? Well, we see that the more the more surprised individuals are by a given piece of news, the more they overreact, particularly if they are young. So we actually try to directly measure this impressionability. This, again, is related to this mechanism in psychology whereby if you are given lots of specific news about specific cases of, for example, COVID sickness, that makes a much bigger impression on you than if you are just given a statistic about how likely you are to have to be sick given your age. So you're much more, you respond much more to specific examples than to an overall statistic. And this mechanism is stronger for younger people than for older people. Perhaps older people are better able to read statistics and they are less impressionable by specific examples. So not to take much longer, let me conclude. The broad finding is that despite an abundance of information, beliefs about COVID-19 are far from accurate, and this has kind of important implications because of the direction of these inaccurate beliefs. So, for example, if the elderly are actually not worried enough, they're too optimistic, they may take more health risks than they should, with bad health outcomes on average. If instead young people are very conservative, and when I say young, I mean up to not only up to roughly up to 40, so it's not that young. There's a significant part of the labor force. If the young are too conservative, it's very unhelpful for economic recovery. They don't want to go back to work in the office. They don't want to consume and to engage in economic activity, which with potentially bad outcomes for the economy as a whole. So in a sense, this particular type of distortions that we find gives us the worst of both worlds. This survey is actually, and this setting is actually very useful to try to understand what drives the difference and the disagreements in beliefs that we have about the world around us, even in the case where there's so much data as there is for COVID-19, right? We find that despite all this data, what predicts beliefs is how exposed you are to news, but social media news, your own experience, and so on. So in ongoing work, what we try to show is we're going to try to dig in. We're going to try to dig in to this mechanism whereby trying to check whether it is true that young people are more impressionable than older people, and this potentially has a lot of implications not only for this setting but also for other settings, politics, persuasion, and so forth. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Pedro. I like to usually claim that I'm young. And I'm usually more optimistic. So I think your point around beliefs and behaviors is also, for me, interesting. I think, Renee, what you and Pedro have shown is really the value of high quality research, because some of the things that you've shared are counterintuitive. Let me now invite Professor Thomas Hellman, who will be presenting a paper that he co-authored entitled A Theory of Voluntary Testing and Self-Isolation in an Ongoing Pandemic. I hope, Tom, you'll also share some thoughts about the Creative Destructive Lab Recovery Program, which you've been very much behind. Let me hand over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen. And can people see the screen? Yes, wonderful. So my pleasure to be here. Normally, when we do research, we start with the concepts, we do start with the research, and then, we hope to impact reality. In this particular project, it worked the other way around. So I have the privilege of leading the Creative Destruction Lab, which is a acceleration program for science-based ventures here at Oxford. And at the beginning of March, when we saw where the world was heading, we said we have a responsibility, we have an opportunity to help. And we've convened as a network of 8 universities in North America and Europe, a program called CDL Recovery, Creative Destruction Lab Recovery, that was meant to help entrepreneurs who are building solutions for the COVID crisis to accelerate their growth and achieve their potential. The focus was on medium-term solutions, and for this program to come together, we've worked across the universities. We had over 400 mentors from all around the world. We supported 99 ventures in different areas, different applications of COVID-related challenges. Interestingly enough, it was very collaborative. The vast majority of our ventures actually received mentorship on both sides of the Atlantic, so to speak. And we've also had a very significant involvement from MBA students, both at Oxford and our partner sites. The initiative was guided by a number of academics who sort of developed a thesis. The thesis was, first, entrepreneurs are not the best to solve the short-term problems. So it is about building, better masks or things that are immediately needed. Large corporations have a better advantage. But when it comes to innovative solutions that become relevant, say, over a 1 to 2 year horizon, and sometimes even longer, entrepreneurs are much more innovative. We also then decided to focus on what we called information-based solutions. So by the early summer, we were essentially focused on those entrepreneurs who don't consider the COVID problem as an always-on problem, meaning the issue isn't that we should just sort of go into lockdown, or we should all wear masks, or we should all do everything the same. Instead, we're looking for smart solutions where we can identify people that are at high risk or people that are infected, and then accommodate our decision-making on the basis of information. That simple concept has enormous implications for the kind of solutions you build in the COVID crisis. And we think, frankly, often it's been underappreciated how central information is. Now, at the core of that information problem is identifying who has caught COVID and not. In the program, we saw a total of 15 ventures specifically focusing on COVID testing. And so since April, we've been working with these companies, and we've learned an enormous amount. And so I knew how to pronounce lateral flow devices in April. I think, in the last month, people have heard about lateral flow devices because they are an important alternative to the standard PCR solution for testing for COVID. This table just shows you the sort of the dimensions in which these entrepreneurs are pushing the boundaries. They're using different types of tests. The swab test is very unpleasant and not always very accurate. So they're trying to move towards saliva, in a few cases, blood or stool. Very importantly, the location of testing that these entrepreneurs are proposing is moving out of the clinical setting. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on that point because I think it's a profound point. There are issues about cost, about speed, about data management that accompanies all of these COVID testing solutions. So in the process of that, and I think this is sort of a collective learning process, we've learned the importance of asymptomatic testing. And I think, in the last month or two, I've seen the number of news coverage on this going up dramatically. Let me first emphasize that this is very counterintuitive for the medical profession. And in some sense, at the risk of simplifying, there's the traditional medical view, and then there are some public health experts who quite often disagree with the mainstream clinical view. The mainstream clinical view is testing is something that the medical system should do. And so it's very much focused on testing symptomatic people. Today, if you drive into Oxford, there's a big sign that says, please only test if you're symptomatic. We don't think that cuts it. We don't think that that is enough to deal with this crisis. And so these entrepreneurs that we work with are focusing a lot on these new asymptomatic testing devices. I am super excited about my colleagues, specifically Mariah, Peter, and Andrew, who are leading the FACTS project. So the FACTS project is a voluntary testing project. Said Business School was selected as the first site in the UK to be trialing this new approach. And these wonderful colleagues are literally right now working on figuring out protocols that will make voluntary testing a practical reality and organizational reality, starting with the Said Business School. So I'm super impressed and in communication with my wonderful colleagues. You may have read in the last few days about Liverpool doing citywide testing. Expect a lot more of this. We think it's at the core of the COVID crisis. So where does research come into this? Basically, this experience of working with entrepreneurs, trying to push the boundary, made me as a researcher aware of some of the conceptual issues, some of the barriers that these entrepreneurs were facing, and made me think about the underlying economic challenges. So in this research, I will differ from a little bit from Renee and Pedro. I have no data. I would love to get data, but this data is being generated as we speak, and most of the data will become available in the years to come. But sometimes, as economists, we use theory as a way of conceptualizing, of providing conceptual clarity on the issues at hand. And given the novelty of this phenomenon, I decided to hone my theory skills and build a little theory, a mathematical model of behavior around voluntary testing. And the key word is voluntary. This is not a mandated test. This is a voluntary test of people who are asymptomatic. And there are many reasons why you wouldn't want to do it. So we asked the question, who would do it? That's the first question. Who would actually want to buy or take these tests? Now, a big issue with these tests is imperfections, false positives, false negatives. How do they matter? And then what's the social benefit of testing? Without going into the details of the model, let me give you the highlights, the conceptual insights that come out of this theory exercise. In the absence of testing, in the top row, you see sort of the red and the green, and that's, in a model, we deliberately try to simplify the world. The world is very complicated. The role of a theorist is to provide conceptual clarity by creating something very simple. And so in the world, we have two types of behavior, people who self-isolate and people who go out. The work that Renee presented very clearly showed that the people who go out are much more at danger of getting infected. That's underlying everything we're going to do here. If you introduce self-testing, our theory predicts that it is precisely the people who are on the cusp between self-isolation and wanting to go out who are going to be most interested in taking the test. People who are very eager to go out on the right-hand side will go out, and they won't take the test. Even if they had maybe a negative result, a positive result, they would still go out. And people who are extremely cautious will self-isolate no matter. So the test is in that middle section, and the cheaper, the more available the test becomes, the larger the fraction of the population that would voluntarily self-test. Now, the number one challenge that a lot of people talk about, and that you will hear a lot about in the news in the coming weeks and months, is, well, what about false positives? What about false negatives? What our research tries to do is to try to put some objective thinking into how serious is this problem and how should we think about it. So this little table, as simple as it seems, is maybe the most important thing I want you to remember from from my talk, is we can think of four kinds of people who are infected and then they get tested correctly. That's the first row. Then what if there's a false negative? Then people who are not infected, false negative, and finally a correct negative. Well, the two last rows of this table are really important because it asks what would happen in the absence of a test. And very often when you talk to the clinical mainstream, they sort of think, well, we shouldn't have these tests, people at home. They should really go to the hospital and take the proper test. So in their mind, the default is a clinical test. We're going to say that's the wrong theory. That is not the way we can look at COVID testing, because the decisions that people actually take are what we're looking at here. And half the people, or some fraction of the population, will take a COVID test as an alternative to self-isolation, and the other segment of the population will take a COVID test as an alternative to going out without a test. So the medical mainstream has the wrong benchmark for these kind of tests. They have a very important role for people who are symptomatic and who are, go to the hospital because they're worried about it. But the asymptomatic world works very differently than the clinical world. And what we then discover, each of these 4 rows contains, I think, a gem of insight. If you go, for example, for the first row, if you take the test, you're infected, and the test detects it, well, then you're going to self-isolate, and you're going to wait where the symptoms develop. Taking a test actually doesn't change anything. The test tells you correctly that you're positive, and so you're staying at home and you wait. If you would have gone out, the test is super useful. That's why I use the color green, because it says, hey, I'm infected. I shouldn't go out. I shouldn't infect others. The last row is the exact equivalent, which is a correct negative test, which is you are fine. You're not infected, and the test you're fine. Well, you go out, and it helps people who would otherwise have self-isolated. Now, what's very interesting is people are particularly worried about these false negatives. Well, yes, the false negatives in the second row is a problem, because it will send out some people who think that they're not infected when in fact they are infected. But remember, that's only for that fraction of people who would have self-isolated. There's a whole other fraction of people who, even if they take a false negative, it doesn't matter, because they would have gone out anyway. And then in the third row, you've got the flip side of that. Sometimes the false positive looks terrible. Oh my God, somebody is being a false positive. Well, it is bad if the person would have gone out and now they have to stay at home, and when in fact they're perfectly healthy. But if they would have stayed at home, there is no difference. So this gives you a framework for thinking and, frankly, making sure that we interpret false positives and false negatives correctly. Now, we still have the bottom line. Should we use tests, especially if home tests are likely to have false positives and negatives? And let there be no doubt, they're going to be false negatives and false positives the moment we move to a home-based testing, without a doubt. So what our theory suggests, and that these are deliberately provocative results, but they come out of the mathematics of the model, is even if imperfect, cheaper testing reduces the infection risk. So the infection risk, the risk that if you go out that you get infected, goes down. And the key idea is that the fraction of people who are actually healthy and go out is going up with testing. And since COVID is based on interactions, having a large population of healthy people going out is actually a good thing. The effect of cheaper testing on the total infection rate is ambiguous. False negatives can send people out of self-isolation into going out, and so they could get infected, but our results show that there's some ambiguity. It doesn't have to go up. Very importantly, from an economic perspective, the total utility increases if more testing becomes available. And then we have some provocative results that actually says if people misunderstand these tests and maybe naively trust them too much, that may actually be good. And if they naively distrust them too much, they just don't trust these tests, that's not a good thing for the infection rate and the infection risk in the population. Overall, this theory puts a very clear mandate into to the government to support home-based testing. And that is quite a contrary message to what a lot of the mainstream clinical view is, that is very worried about these false positive negatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. It appears your research is onto something that I think could positively disrupt the medical profession. I remember in the abstract you and your co-authors included that the results indeed could challenge the clinical medical profession. I remember in the abstract you and your co-authors included that the results. You and your co-authors indicated that the results could indeed challenge the clinical mainstream view that diagnostic testing is a prerogative of the medical profession and supports the notion, of course, that self-testing can be what will move us to supporting the economy, to transition from where it is. I've been fascinated, Renee, Pedro, and Tom, at how the three of you have made research that is absolutely important for us, intellectual, but also just fun. Renee, you said that because of this wrong notion about men facing greater risk, that some men are actually getting themselves injected with estrogen. So now they know they shouldn't. Pedro, you talked about being careful of the news that you consume. And I'm trying to decide whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic, even though I'm in the group that should be more optimistic, because maybe my Twitter consumption is affecting me being on the border. And Tom, you talked about that trusting naively could actually be good. So it's been, for me, it's been fascinating, and I'm sure that I speak for all of the people that I see have joined us, and I like when people say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, because I should actually say that, because we have people from Brazil, from Greece, from Japan, from Kenya, from Indonesia, from Italy, from Nigeria, from Peru, from Romania, from Turkey, and of course, from here in the United Kingdom. Please keep your questions coming. I will ask them as we go along. Renee, can I start with you? I'd like to ask you my first question. Can you give these results a causal interpretation? Can work lead to worse health outcomes for women? I'm concerned about that because, of course, we want more women. We want gender equality in the workplace. So I really just want to understand that notion a little bit better.
Yeah. So
all of the participants on the event.
Yeah. So that's a really good question, Arunma. I argue that the results can be given a causal interpretation because, if you think about the relationship I'm documenting, we didn't have a pandemic before, so the pandemic can't really explain women's work patterns, right? So there are many sort of social processes that have shaped women's work patterns, and now we see sort of what's happening to their health outcomes as a function of their work patterns. And so you see there's a very clear positive correlation between women's participation in the workforce and their death rates due to COVID. Now, of course, there could be other factors at the country level that could help explain this relationship. But I think in order to explain away the finding that I showed you, you need to have something that's country level and that's social in nature. So basically, it would be very hard to say that what I'm documenting is not related to a causal impact of social structures, but instead is some genetic factor. Okay, so one can get into the mechanics and think about this a lot, but I won't go into that more here. But let me just say that I'm convinced that there's a causal relationship between social structures and health outcomes. Now, related to the second point that you alluded to, of course, I also care about gender equality, which is actually one reason that I wrote this paper, because I was very concerned about by the fact that people started saying, oh, we don't have to treat women, right? And so basically what I'm showing is that, yes, work is hazardous to your health, right? But we know this already, right? So if you work, you get more stressed. The more you work, the more stressed you are, and the more sort of exposure, like you develop comorbidities, you are more likely to have a heart attack. I mean, men die from work all the time. And so now women work more. Of course, they're also going to die more from work. That's my argument. But let me also say that much more work needs to be, or much more research needs to be done on this. But my point is really that there should be gender equality in healthcare, right? So along with gender equality in the workforce, there needs to be gender equality in sort of the policy treatment of men and women, and also in healthcare. So let me stop there. I hope that sort of answered the question. I think you're muted, Arunma.
Yes, so I was saying that I like your point about gender equality in healthcare. Pedro, I have a question, another question that I'm sure that the participants would connect with. What if we give people more information? Would that do away with their misperceptions? Wouldn't that do away with their misperceptions?
Well, it's really interesting. So people are awash in information in some sense, right? They have statistics from the newspapers, they see on TV, and then they see all the statistics, and then they hear stories about their friends, they read on Facebook or they see on Twitter different things. So the question really is, how do people awash in information interpret and put together all these different pieces of information that they're given? You know, from the statistics from TV, from doctors, to the experiences of their friends and their own experiences. And what we know is that one vivid story about somebody getting sick, like a 25-year-old with no preconditions and passing away, has a huge impact, much bigger impact than knowing that happens in 0.01% of the cases. And so we are programmed in a way, we are such that our brains are such that if you give me one vivid story and I imagine it, it's very easy for me to remember it. I think about it all the time, and that's going to be important for me. Now, of course, if I give people information and everybody in the morning sees the information of what's the likelihood of risk of death, etc., then if I ask them, people can repeat it. People can say, yes, I know that it's 0.01% chance. But when they think, oh, do I want to go out? That's not the information that they use to make that decision. What they use is, oh, what about that person that I heard about that had no preconditions? That's what comes to mind at the moment of making the decision. So really, this is about understanding how people use the information that they have. And if it is the case that people, particularly the young, are more likely to use these vivid stories, then what one needs to do is to correct these beliefs, if you want to do that, is to provide them with counter anecdotes. Think of the millions of people who go out and don't get of your age and don't get infected, or if they do, they recover quickly. So you give them vivid stories about that happened. Of course, it's a very tricky business to try to influence beliefs by giving them information in this way, right? Because you don't want to be in the business of telling people exactly how to think. I mean, in some sense, what economists like to do is to give people information and then people reason and make their own minds, right? What we're seeing here, and not only here, in a lot of other research, is that the way exactly that you give people information actually matters a lot. Some information is very persuasive, like the anecdotes. Some information, like statistics, is very little persuasive. And so, for policymakers, it's an important point. How do we provide information that is sufficiently persuasive that it can, surpass Twitter in its influence?
Wow. The way you give information matters. Keep the questions coming. I know we have only about 7 minutes left till the end of the program. And I think you can reach each of our professors with additional questions or comments if I'm not able to take them. Tom, I have 2 questions for you that I'd like you to comment on. The first one is, what is the role of people's trust in screening procedures? And I'm giving you the bonus question as a former regulator. So should regulators look differently at COVID screening than clinical testing?
Yeah, thank you. Those are excellent questions, and it's actually, I'm not sure how you managed to do this so beautifully, Aruna, to follow Pedro, because I think the question about trust is really very, very closely related to the sort of phenomenon that Pedro is documenting. I'll be honest, my worry is that we're going to be guided by a few nightmare stories. And the classical nightmare story is, I was infected, I took a test, it was a false negative, and I became a super spreader. And those stories can be very powerful, but as Pedro pointed out, powerful doesn't mean always representative. And so I think the level of trust that is given to these new generation of COVID screening that we're going to see is very important. I think it'll be very important to have the counter story, to think about, well, yes, but what did this allow? It allows us to go back to work. It allows healthy people to play important roles in the economy. And so I think the building of trust is very important. Now that leads to the government, and I never want to simplify government. I'm sure you have very refined views on that. But your question about the government, I think a lot of attention gets to sort of the messages that are coming out of executive. But I think the regulator actually plays a role that maybe is underappreciated. And frankly, I think is quite challenged because regulation, certainly medical regulation, has been dominated by the medical mainstream. So when our entrepreneurs that we saw in the Creative Destruction Lab built their new COVID testing devices, every one of them said, well, I have to do more research in order to match the gold standard of PCR testing. Now, only recently people have figured out actually the PCR gold standard isn't that perfect. In fact, it measures being infected. It doesn't measure being infectiousness. And we could have had some of these tests out if the regulator was able to, in some sense, develop new, more flexible standards that are more appropriate for the situation at hand. The key message here is that I think the regulator, I understand why there's a process for which regulation has to happen, but I think it challenges them for a level of flexibility and forward thinking that they're not used to.
Wow. I'm worrying that we have 4 minutes left. There is another question that we received, and I'd like any of you to comment on this issue of trust. Is the issue of public trust, or is it a disconnect with the establishment? Is that a factor in the public deciding how to respond to COVID-19? And who wants to go first? And I will give you all 30 seconds and any other thing that you want to share before I start to bring our session to a close. I think we need another session on this research, maybe in a few months when you've done a bit more work, and also the participants have also reread this absolutely amazing research pieces that you have produced. So does anybody want to say anything about trust? And then I'll bring the session to a close. Do you want me to call?
I can say.
Pedro, go ahead.
Just 20 seconds. That is, as a good researcher, I'll say we need more research on that. It's actually a phenomenal question, given that both false positives and false negatives, both pro stories and contra stories, they will always emerge. The world is complex. We always have examples of one thing and the other. And if you want to make a point that testing is good, or that you should participate in the workforce and so on, there's always counterexamples. And so it's a very important point to try to understand how information is used for persuasion and how people spontaneously pick the types of information that they pick in order to be persuaded of a particular view, and how come in the end we have such heterogeneity, such diversity in views about what's going on right now. I just want to say that this is a fantastic thing that we are actually trying to work on. A lot of us in economics in general in the field are trying to work on this, and so stay tuned.
You're muted. Arun, you're muted.
Sorry. I was going through some of the questions that we got, and I'll just read them and then close. Are there ways to build incentives to use tests targeting the Go Out Anyway group? This is from Artemis Goss. Whilst airlines, sorry, I'm trying to go through them. Okay, I think what we'll do, I'm sure that our distinguished professors will answer some of your questions as they sharpen the research. But I think that the analysis, Renee, Pedro, and Tom, your findings and your analysis are absolutely phenomenal. I've just been wowed by what you've shared. even though I'd read the research reports beforehand. I think what you shared has been absolutely phenomenal. And I think it will help us in society as we think about moving towards going back to normal. And I'm not talking about the new normal, I'm talking about going back to normal, which is my optimistic view of things. So let me just start by expressing my sincere appreciation to each one of you, Renee, Pedro, and Tom, for what has been an amazing presentation and discussion about how we can truly conquer COVID-19. Let me also appreciate very much the work of our colleagues behind the scene, notably Alistair Scott, Christine Homoki, Fred Davis, and John Harvey, and a number of others. Finally, to all of you who joined from around the world, thank you so much for joining us. Remember, our next edition is tomorrow, 11th November at 2 p.m. GMT, same time. It's another interesting topic, and it's entitled Youth Setting the Agenda, Transport and Fossil Fuels. Details are available if you Google Oxford Answers, if you follow us on Side Business School's LinkedIn, Twitter, and other channels. Thank you, and stay safe.